OpenAI just put its next model behind a government gate, and that may be the real story. Welcome back to Midnight Signal AI. It's June 27th, 2026.
We've got the preview that's stirring the whole market, a new Anthropic release that also got limited clearance, and a fresh accusation that could turn into a major model theft fight.
And there's more. One story about who gets access, another about who copied whom, plus a couple of signals that the business around these systems is changing fast. Let's start with the biggest one, OpenAI's GPT-5.6 Sol Preview, because the launch itself is only half the headline.
That's the part people miss when they just read the model name. OpenAI is not only saying, here's a better model, it's saying the deployment layer is now part of the product.
Right, and on the company's own framing, GPT-5.6 Sol is supposed to be stronger in coding, science, and cybersecurity, which is a very specific trio. That tells you where OpenAI thinks the pressure is building.
It also says something about competition. If you're selling into builders, researchers, or security teams, you don't just need raw capability, you need trust, and in this case, clearance.
And that brings us to the access story around it, because multiple outlets reported the same basic event. This release is being limited to approved customers while review continues.
That's a big shift. In the old AI launch cycle, the questions were, how good is it and how fast can everyone get it? Now, the first question is, who's allowed to touch it?
And OpenAI isn't alone in that. Anthropic's Claude Mythos 5 hit a similar wall, but in the opposite direction, because the government greenlit a limited release for trusted partners.
So both frontier labs are effectively operating in a permissioned lane. That's not a small detail. It changes how fast the ecosystem can test, integrate, and build on top of these models.
Here's the Anthropic story from Devdiscourse and also reported by Ynet News. Claude Mythos 5 is cleared for limited release, again to a narrow set of partners.
It's interesting that both OpenAI and Anthropic are being described through access restrictions rather than just product launches. That means the public narrative is shifting from what can the model do to what can the model legally do right now.
And while those two are dealing with approval, Anthropic also has a very different problem on its hands, a serious cloning accusation aimed at Alibaba.
This is the kind of story that can change company behavior quickly because it goes right to training data, competitive intelligence, and whether model vendors can police imitation.
PYMNTS and the Indian Express reported Anthropic accusing Alibaba of running 29 million fake queries to clone Claude.
29 million is not a random number you throw around lightly. If that allegation holds up, it's the kind of scale that makes everyone in the industry rethink how much usage telemetry matters.
Exactly, and the stakes aren't just legal. If model vendors start assuming every large customer might be probing for cloning, then the whole trust model around APIs gets stricter.
Which loops back to those limited previews we just talked about. These stories are connected. Approval on one side, suspicion on the other.
Speaking of suspicion, there's also a separate OpenAI story today from WCJB. Another FSU shooting victim has filed a lawsuit against OpenAI.
That's a reminder that OpenAI's week is not just about model launches and market excitement. It's also about how visible and exposed the company is when its tools end up inside real-world harm narratives.
And that visibility shows up in the markets too. Barron's reported that IPO fears around OpenAI are hitting Oracle and other stocks exposed to the ChatGPT maker.
That's a very market-specific kind of anxiety. Investors aren't only pricing in OpenAI's future, they're pricing in everyone else who's tied to its trajectory.
Right, and it suggests the OpenAI story has become a broader trade. Infrastructure, partners, and adjacent beneficiaries all move when the company's path changes.
That's the hidden angle here. When frontier AI moves from novelty to infrastructure, the market starts treating these labs like systemically important actors.
Now, a different kind of signal on the demand side. AI Insider says Claude's paying consumer base grew 75% in 2026 as Anthropic closes the gap with ChatGPT.
That's useful context because it tells you the consumer side is still alive, even while the frontier labs are wrestling with security and access restrictions.
And if Anthropic is genuinely narrowing the paid user gap, that strengthens the idea that this market is no longer one-sided. Users are voting with subscriptions, not just benchmarks.
And because it's Anthropic, the consumer story doesn't live by itself. It feeds back into enterprise credibility, product iteration, and maybe even how much room the company has to keep pushing the frontier.
Before we wrap, one last quick signal from a different frontier player. Mars partnered with Google Cloud to deploy Gemini Enterprise for its global associates.
That's a good reminder that not every important AI story is a model launch. A lot of the real competition is happening inside companies, where assistants get tied to daily work and become hard to remove.
And on the research side, Archive put out a paper today on prompt-composed agentic systems and another on the limits of data-driven reasoning. We're not spending the whole show on papers, but the direction is worth noting.
Yeah, the through line across all of today's stories is control. Control over access, control over imitation, control over deployment, and control over trust.
Now, let's shift gears to robotics. The interesting part here is that Watch Act is trying to close a pretty real gap. Most robot benchmarks show a single image and a command, but real life is a moving target. A person opens a cabinet, sets something down, points at an object, then walks away, and the robot has to understand the whole chain.
That matters because manipulation failures often come from missing context, not missing motor control. If the robot knows what happened before the current moment, it can infer what's available, what's been moved, and what the human probably intended.
So this is basically asking robots to watch like humans do, not just stare like cameras do. Exactly. And once robots can reason over observed behavior, you get a better foundation for collaborative systems, not just pick-and-place machines, but assistants that can actually follow the flow of human activity.
And that also makes the evaluation itself more honest. If a system only works when the world is frozen into one frame, it is not ready for shared spaces. A benchmark like this is a reminder that robotics is really about understanding motion, sequence, and intent, all at once.
On the robotics side, there is also this autonomous agricultural rover work, and I like it because it targets a very specific real-world blind spot. A lot of field machines can cruise along happily until a hidden rock, branch, tool, or clump of debris sits below the canopy where the usual sensors struggle. The twist is that the system is not relying entirely on labeled examples of every possible obstacle. It learns the normal look of the environment and flags when something feels off. That can be a stronger fit for agriculture because farms are not static labs, they are living, changing scenes.
So the goal is basically notice weird stuff before the rover drives into it.
Pretty much, and that kind of robustness is what makes autonomous farming feel less like a demo and more like infrastructure. If the robot can stay cautious in unfamiliar conditions, it becomes a lot more deployable.
It also shows how robotic safety often starts with perception before autonomy. You don't need a grand sci-fi brain first. You need a machine that can reliably notice when the world stops matching its expectations.
On the medical front, this language-based digital twin idea is a fascinating example of how AI is moving from generic tools toward personalized care. Instead of treating every patient conversation the same, the system tries to model one person's own speech patterns, vocabulary choices, and conversational habits over time. That matters for cognitive care because language drift can be an early signal. A person might pause more, repeat themselves, or organize thoughts differently long before a diagnosis is obvious. If a model can track that gently and consistently, it could become a useful screening layer.
I like the promise, but it definitely raises the bar on trust. This is not a toy use case.
Right, and that's the key point. The opportunity is better monitoring and earlier support, but only if clinicians can interpret the output and the system stays anchored to real-world validation.
It is one of those ideas that feels both hopeful and delicate. Helpful if it catches a problem sooner, but only if it stays respectful of privacy, context, and the fact that human conversation is never just data.
Over in healthcare AI, this clinical ASR audit is exactly the kind of work that can quietly change practice. Speech recognition in a hospital or clinic is already hard, but once you add multilingual patients, accents, psychiatric interviews, and real-world audio, the error surface gets much bigger. What makes this important is that transcription errors are not harmless. If its system mishears symptoms, medication names, or the structure of a patient's narrative, that mistake can ripple into documentation and follow-up care. The paper is pushing on the question of whether these models are evenly reliable across languages and demographics.
Which is really the core of it. If the tool is uneven, then the workload shifts back onto the people who need help the most.
Exactly. Auditing and debiasing are not afterthoughts here. They are the foundation for making clinical speech AI safe enough to trust. On the hardware side, this is a pretty significant signal. When a model company starts leaning into custom silicon, it's usually because the economics have gotten serious enough that generic hardware is no longer the whole answer. A custom chip can be optimized for the exact workloads that matter most: inference patterns, memory behavior, power use, whatever the company is trying to squeeze. Even before any product ships at scale, the signal to the market is important. The biggest AI labs are thinking in terms of vertical integration now.
So it's not just faster chips, it's a control play.
Exactly. It's about dependency, cost, and leverage. And if more AI leaders follow that path, the hardware race gets broader than one vendor or one generation of GPUs.
And that makes the whole stack feel a little more like the early cloud era, except now the bottleneck is raw compute instead of servers. The companies that can design around it get a huge strategic advantage.
And to end on a lighter note, this one is a great example of how AI can be both playful and awkward at the same time. Music generation sounds delightful until you start asking what happens when the prompt borrows too heavily from a real artist's lyrics, voice, or style. That's where the paper gets interesting. It treats the whole workflow as a legal, technical puzzle, not just a creativity tool, because the same system that lets someone make an original track can also make it very easy to step into copyright trouble.
In other words, the technology is singing, but the lawyers are already in the room.
Exactly. And with music tools getting more accessible, those questions are only going to get louder.
It's a funny one, but also a preview of a much bigger debate. When does inspiration become imitation? And who gets to decide? That's a very 2026 problem to have. If you zoom out, the frontier race is getting less like a simple product sprint and more like a managed airspace. The winners may be the labs that can pair capability with governance, distribution, and legal durability. And that makes the next few months feel less like a launch calendar and more like a pressure test for the whole industry.
That's the big picture. The models are getting stronger, but the rules around them are getting heavier by the day. Stay curious, stay informed. See you tomorrow.